So that was just fun.
What is this
Roof mirror on. Call me.
It's just Allison, under it is just like an alcove for the bank for cards.
One of the neat things I did.
This is so it needs the bank.
Well, no, because you just pull under there. It's open on the bottom.
Oh, you're right. We're right above the bank right now.
Yeah.
It's a drive-thru?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
So this one,
Oh, okay.
Banks have those.
this
You're
is
so
my
clever, Elijah.
this is my how to pet a dog.
I have communications. I have communications
I know.
this year, and I had to think about something.
I had to think about something.
Is that the only thing?
Oh my gosh!
First, grab the dog and hold it.
So this is how to pet a dog.
Oh, jeez.
Amazing!
As a dog, of course, a really big dog that's
You should show them how to relax with your dog.
You should do how to garden next.
Yes.
How to properly garden.
Yeah, because all my plants die.
How to water a plant.
Oh my god! Please do.
You should show them how to relax with your dog.
Your dog has to be present in every video.
Yes. Fat dog.
Yes. Oh no. Why'd you say it's
Is this
that,
video
that
going to
dog?
pamphlet?
I have 3.
Okay. I didn't know something happened.
I didn't fight alright.
I've had that happen. Bad.
Dry Hunde.
Okay.
Dry Hunde. Dry Hunde.
Dry Hunde. And I have 3 dogs.
Dry Hunde.
it's a really big dog.
Wunder.
Yes.
Das ist zu viel.
Oh, was haben das alles? Das alles.
Really short dog is chilly.
Do this, Doug.
She is Snorkline. She's
Oh, she died? I thought you said she's no more. I was like, no.
no, she's still with us.
Oh, she's so good. I like her little friend.
All your friends will see you in It's 2 legs disagree.
And she hates being petted, as you can tell.
Oh.
Enough.
Das ist ein Morsch. She likes. Oh well.
Show us another YouTube video.
Yeah. What are your
How to
most
relax
popular?
with a dog.
Yeah.
I want to see the most viewed one.
Oh, this is the one that I got. This is the one that I got.
13,000?
Yeah, the most hits. And the reason for it is, I think, because of the title. Everybody in the lower 48 wanted to go look at the lady on the deck in the snow. They thought maybe she would be nude. And she is. The only thing is...
So, do you like the snow? Are you having fun?
Lady is no longer. She is dead.
But look,
No.
everything is getting so snowy. So snowy.
Let's bring that up to 14,000 and get them all out.
Well, that was just weird. Because everybody thought the title meant that it was porno or something. You know? They didn't realize that, no, that's the name of a St. Bernard. You know, this is Princess. She's another dog.
Is she still alive?
Yes, but she's 16 and she's on her last legs.
She only has one leg.
She just hops on one leg.
Well, she has all 4 of them, but they're all like, they don't really work right. So she like rolls down the steps. That's not right. You shouldn't do that when you're about 7 pounds. But this is another how to study, I think. How to study peacocks. Somewhere along the way.
Oh no. She's so
I pick
cute.
up. For some reason, dogs like to read. But they They want you to like stop reading and just pay attention to them. They don't really want to just read with you.
Have you seen a how-to basic video? It's a YouTube channel.
When I went, it wasn't called basic, it was boot camp. No, it was basic.
How-to basic.
Boot camp was for the Navy.
Doesn't have anything to
Oh.
do with camp. Basic is the Air Force. You should put up that how-to basic video. It would really help us a lot.
Also, those are fun. So yeah, I've been making these ever since YouTube arrived and let us put videos up there for free. And the university encouraged us to buy that specific brand. That's why I bought that one. Because they gave us a class and said, get this camera, and the university will let you put it on. YouTube wasn't available then, on a website, and then your like online students can watch your videos to kind of add to your online course, right? So I bought the camera, started making videos, and I said, so okay, where's the web page so that I could upload them? And they said, oh, we haven't gotten the money for it yet. And they never did. So that was the end of that. But when YouTube came along, hey, guess what? Now you have a free place where you can put videos.
Do you earn money from your videos?
No, that would be wrong. Besides, I don't know how to do it.
Mother Grace.
So, that's just fun. But most of the videos I put that are, of course, in my classes, just like this. It's mostly for the students that aren't here. They can do that. There are some problems with that, though. There are new standards. They're not that new. They're a couple years old. That require all the videos that you make available to your class to be available to everyone regardless of their abilities. And so there are standards that all such videos have to have, including captions for the folks that can't listen. And if YouTube automatically captions it, but if you follow it, it doesn't do a very good job of it. It seems that, and sometimes even it ends up in Japanese, which is weird because you're speaking English. The Japanese, I'm sure, isn't very good because I'm not speaking Japanese and it's not translating.
Maybe you should do this entire class in German and see what happens.
It would probably mean that only 2 or 3 people could stay, so that wouldn't. Besides, I wouldn't be able to do a very good job because my German isn't. Es ist sehr schlecht. Ich bin nicht.
We wouldn't know.
So I could periodically throw in some Ruski, and no one would. That often happens to me when I'm trying to think in a foreign language. Es ist all gemischt. I get, whatever word comes into my head, that's the one I use.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute, that was French. I'm trying to speak German, and French words pop in there. No. Ich bin ein Croissant. Famous phrase by sort of not a president in Berlin who actually said, Ich bin ein Berliner. That was the mistake. He's not supposed to say ein Berliner. If you were going to say I'm a Berliner, you just say Ich bin Berliner. But he said Ich bin ein Berliner, which means I'm a sweet roll. That was Kennedy's mistake. That never even left. Okay, so you're all familiar. No, Kennedy gave a speech in Berlin. Said the proudest boast anyone can make is Ich bin ein Berliner. And the crowd all cheered, but at the same time there was, what did he say? Aber auf Deutsch. Was habe ich gesagt? was habe er gesagt. So, okay. So lots of stuff to do today, actually, rather than just hop and off about stuff like YouTube videos. So we're going from page 179 to 181. Not much reading, but if you've followed along with like David Brooks and stuff, you know why he thinks that's not a brilliant thing to assign students. But this is interesting, because if we go and look at it, this is really ancient stuff. Plato, the beginning of everything. So, a neat thing about this, by the way, it's just one page, but Timaeus is actually much longer than that. But this is from the Timaeus. Did the universe always exist? Or did it have a beginning? And the Timaeus is a kind of recording of an individual, a Greek, who went to Egypt and had a conversation with the priests, the Egyptian priests, who basically thought that the Greeks were just really idiotic. They have no history, no wisdom. You guys are like babes in the woods kind of folk, you know, that's naive. And I'm sure that that was absolutely correct. In fact, probably a lot of what got the Greeks' philosophies started were their wandering, discovering these kinds of interesting things from not only the Egyptians but other people. That Pythagoras, a lot of Pythagoras' ideas seem to be from the Jewish scripture, the Old Testament. And by the way, that's demonstrated by Josephus in his book, The Defense of the Jews. The defense is that the Jews were the ones that Pythagoras stole his stuff from, right? So copyright issues. The Greeks are like the Chinese, you know, they don't pay for anything. They don't attribute anything. They just steal it and make their own money. So that's kind of, no, that was a joke. Because the Greeks and the Chinese are very different. The Chinese are stealing digital stuff because you could just copy movies and stuff. But all you needed to do was cite things. But no one started to cite things really until the 1820s. That's when footnotes started. That's why if we talk about Descartes stealing from Augustine, well, everyone did that. There was no issue with citing sources and not saying that this actually comes from, etc. But so, what's the main thing that comes from the Timaeus? If you think how old this is Egyptian thought, really, right? And so who the heck knows how old this is? But we do still have the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is the directions on how for the young pharaoh to get into heaven, right? I don't know if you've read it or not. But they were very concerned about things of this sort for way longer, right? And what they believe about the divine, the creation, and this is like, really when you think of it, it's you should insert Homer Simpson's remark, duh, right? D-U-H, Homer Simpson, nobody?
Yeah.
That's passé now? No? Homer Simpson's good.
Yeah.
You guys know who that is. Okay. Actually, by the way, the first philosopher that said duh and accompanied that with a head smack, that gesture was Ludwig Wittgenstein. So that's historical, actually, as far as I know.
How old? What year?
Wittgenstein doing that would be sometime during his tenure teaching at Cambridge, and that would have been in between World War II and his death sometime. He died in 1952, so He was also the first one that invented not wearing a necktie and just having your white collar open with like a sweater. Wittgenstein. So he was actually from Vienna, but all his teaching was in Cambridge. He's one of Bertrand Russell's students. Okay, so the main thing that we get from the Timaeus is that God, or the divine, or whatever you want to call it, Bog, whatever, has to be outside of the universe. Cannot be part of the creation if God is creating the creation. He can't be creating he, she, or it. Can't be creating itself. Right? So this is ancient Egyptian wisdom. And not only do we get the Song of the Dead, we also get an interesting phrase which is still used, and that is God of God, light of light, true God of true God. Have you ever heard that phrase? God of God, light. It's in the light of Catholic Mass. So there's still lots of folks that use it. God of fingers. Music, etc. Nicene Creed. What? God took it away. Wherever. But so that's actually in the Book of the Dead, that God is defined by the ancient Egyptians. So we're looking at what, 4,000 years ago, at least. So that phrase has been around for a long time, right? Which means that mathematically, the Egyptians probably invented that absolute concept of God. It might be around other cultures. Maybe the Egyptians stole it from someone. I don't know. But it seems like it's a kind of mathematical concept. Truth, I would argue, is also founded there, because before you have mathematics, truth seemed to be relevant to the particular context of wherever you were. So, for example, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So what's true? It depends on. And if you think of it as a polytheistic, right, multiple gods, every god has its own location, someplace in some culture, and when you get there, that god has preferences, how it's worshipped and what it's for. So there's hundreds of gods, thousands of gods if you're in India, for example, right? So polytheism means that there's really all these powers in the universe, and you worship each of them, basically like knowing how to clean off the countertops so that you don't get chicken salmonella in your next dish, right? So there's these mysterious powers in the universe, and you need to know all of the various gods, which are basically how-tos in order to live successfully in whatever milieu you're in. Which makes sense, because if you go to a totally different place, the gods are different because the weather patterns are different, the animals are different. So for example, and one of my colleagues, he's now at another university, Sunny, New York, where he's the provost. But Jim Lischka wrote a book and analyzed language, how narratives go from one culture to another, and traced a typical hunting narrative from the ancient Greeks all the way across to Alaskan natives, who basically have the same hunting narrative. It's just that the animals have changed and the language has changed. But the narrative structure is basically just, we're going out, we're looking for this, we find it, we're rowing our boat, we see it, then we kill it, etc. And that's, you can trace that kind of storyline all the way back. But the animals change. So in a sense, the polytheistic religions are kind of worldwide in ancient times. But what happens when you invent math is you say things like, my God is more powerful than your God. And when you start getting into that, you're getting into mathematical relationships where you say, there's a highest number, the greatest God, etc. And so, in a sense, it coincides with the invention of infinity slowly. There's kind of an interesting book about the Jewish conception of God going through this same evolution, essentially. And it's hidden face of God. And it's not the one about science, it's this one by Richard Elliott Friedman. And what it does is it analyzes the Old Testament and analyzes how the concept of God gradually changes from a very polytheistic kind of God that competes with other gods to eventually a God that has no face, because it's now an invisible God that has a place. It sits on the vacant seat. It's not vacant because there's nobody there. It's vacant because you can't describe this God, because that God now has gotten so powerful that it's no longer describable, right? It's beyond our ability to describe it, which is essentially still where things have gone. So that's kind of interesting. So this is a conceptual analysis of, well, what must be the case when what we're trying to really explain is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why are we here? That kind of question, right? Why is everything here? Where did it come from? Well, if you're talking about everything, it can't be self-creative. It has to be the case that something outside of the cosmos, outside of the universe, is responsible for why everything is here. Even if we think today, well, Stephen Hawking has died now, but even if you're thinking about what he says about the main reason that the universe is here is because of the grand unified theory, right, the GUT, right, which basically is a mathematical description of the order of the universe. Now, if we get to that one formula, that will give us the mind of God, right? So even Stephen Hawking is thinking in terms of something that's at least outside of the universe, in the sense that it's not made up of physical matter, which would be created, right? But instead is kind of the logic of the universe. Something about the universe must fit some kind of a telos, a purpose, right? A design. And the design is based on that kind of originating set of formulas, or whatever they are, that enable the universe to either be evolving from nothing or created or whatever, right? So you trace this all the way back to the wise Egyptian priests. Plato passes that on. It gets lost. And unless you're reading Plato, and you're especially reading the Timaeus, you might not be aware of that. I'm sure there's a lot of people that believe in a religious set of principles that think of God as much smaller than that. In fact, there's a book called Your God is Too Small. You know, it's kind of hilarious. Not hilarious in the sense that the argument is hilarious, but in the sense that somebody thought to call that book that name, right? Your God is too small. Is that the original one? Looks like. So, that's cool. Same thing with a speaker that we had here from Yale, the Yale Religion Department. I forget how many years ago, but his name is, shoot, I'll think of it in a minute, maybe. But his argument was in the library and he attracted so many people. We were afraid that the fire department was going to fine us, because the room on the 3rd floor actually has a maximum capacity, and we were well over that. And in fact, there were people standing, like out towards the doors trying to listen. We saved the podcast, but being the university, they lost it. It's gone. I don't know where it went. I used to have a link to it, but the links no longer go to a hard drive that contain it, so don't know where it went. But his argument basically was that you shouldn't really call yourself an atheist. If an atheist believes that there is no God, you're absolutely convinced, which actually requires the faith that there isn't one. It's not provable any more than you might feel that you can prove that there is a God, right? So basically, it's a religion to believe that there is no God. So atheism is not a way out of having a religion. In fact, by my definition, I showed you once, right? My definition of religion. It's believing in a narrative, and every human being has to have a narrative. We're homo neurons. We have to believe in a story, because that's where we get the concept of a role that I'm trying to play, and how good I can play that role. I have to learn how that role should be played. How did Shakespeare actually want you to do this? That kind of thing. How do I maintain that role, etc. So if we think in terms of human goal setting is based on the goals that you get from the story you believe is true, then that's your religion, right? Whatever that is, you have to have one. Or of course, you could be really depressed, right? That's, should I try singing it again? Oh shoot, I can't even get it started for some reason this morning.
The Avril Lavigne.
Avril Lavigne, right? I've played it before, so you all know. I have suffered listening to that song. I found a German version of it that's kind of interesting. How am I going to find it? That's interesting. I posted it on my Facebook account. A way to remember where it was. Is that cool?
I was 10 when all of Alaska lost my dad, and I've always tried to live up to his example.
Wenn du dir Sorgen machst, dann frag mich, ich weiß, dass du gewartet hast. Ich bin jetzt wieder da. Falls du mich noch willst, dann bleib ich hier. Wenn du kannst, dann glaubst du mir. Eine Ewigkeit hab ich nachgedacht, Tage, Nächte, Wochen lang, und ich hab dir etwas mitgebracht.
It's beautiful. So, absolute necessary part of singing a song about depression is that you be emotional. How's that depression?
Yeah.
Yeah. Take me back. Nim, take, mich, me, ruk, back. Like rucksack, backpack. Ouch. Don't walk into a drawer. So that's fun. She's got other songs too, by the way. I was trying to listen. Zaz is fun. Okay. So, the Timaeus, that pretty much covers that. Right? But, the 5 ways. We move 1,200 plus, so what would be at least 1,200, 700, so 1,700 years later, which is still, let's see, if that's 1250, and this is, what year is this, 2018, how many years difference is that? roughly 1250, you're looking at 750 plus 18, so 778. Did I count that right?
750 plus 18.
Yeah.
Yeah, 768.
68. Okay. Either way, that's a long time, basically. By the way, though, when we're talking about Aquinas, we're talking about the actual official dogma, with some changes, of course, of the Orthodox Catholic Church. Is that fun, or what? So when you think about what the Catholic Church dogma is all about, the Catechism, with some updates, of course, but basically you're looking at Thomism from Thomas Aquinas, right? And give you a wonderful. Which page do you want? Wikipedia? Sure. Should I be embarrassed that I use Wikipedia so much? This is ein gutes site. So, Thomas Aquino is an Italian town, so he is. But this is before there are nation states. There are city-states, basically. But so he's in France. He ends up teaching in Paris. But he's a student of Albertus Magnus, which means Albert the Fat, basically. By the way, Aquinas was considered very fat too. In fact, who knows, maybe this is just hagiography, but they say that he was so fat that they actually had to have him sit at the table where they had carved out kind of a circular spot so that he could sit there and eat, because he was too fat to like come up to the table. He doesn't sit and write, he stands and write. And by the way, when people read at this time, it seems like they only knew how to read out loud. Silent reading, like to yourself, hadn't been invented yet. It's an odd thing to think about, right? Because when you read, we all read quietly to ourselves, right? Right? But actually, reading quietly to yourself is kind of a relatively new invention. It was believed that reading meant saying the words out loud when you were looking at the text. So that's just fun. In any case, and of course, by the way, this is before the invention of the printing press, but not the invention of secretaries. So they had, apparently, he did not write a lot of his works himself after a while. He instead would just speak to a room full of scribes who would write them down. So that's pretty handy. And it also gives me another joke, which you will hate. Back then, they had monks to write down everything. Now, when you go to write, you have chipmunks write everything. Is that a good joke?
No.
Chip? Computer chip?
No.
See, when I invent my own jokes, they're terrible. You know, why is that? I don't know.
That one hurt.
Seems like it should have been okay.
It was like too far of a stretch. Yeah.
It's not gonna. It used to be funnier. But, we don't talk about chips being in the computer anymore. Yeah, it's just gone. But what Aquinas gives us, and just kind of a summary here of why he's so significant. So there are two summae. Summae means summations. The one is the Summae Theologica, or the summary of theology. So if you have a theological question, just go to the Summa Theologica. If you're trying to persuade a Gentile to believe in Christianity, then you could go to the Summae Gentilis, and you get that. But so I'll go to the Summa Theologica, which there's actually multiple sources of this online, but let's see if this is the right one. I don't like that one so much. Let me try. Okay, New Advent. For some reason, I like this one much better. So it's online. They advertise it, by the way. They'll say, hey, you should get the DVD or CD or whatever it is. That's just dumb, because of course it's right here online. So unless you don't have internet, I don't know, why would you do that? Okay, but it's broken up into parts. First part, right? And the first of the second part, and then the second of the second parts, and then the third part. What's odd is while he was doing the third part, he died. That's kind of famous too. Lots of phrases about what he said, how he died en route to a conference, ended up getting sick and taken to his sister's castle where he died, etc. But the third part then was finished by his scribes, so they did finish the work, but you can see the supplement to the third part was done by someone else. And so if we go to the first part is about what God is, and notice we already talked about Anselm's definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. And notice that even though this is now a couple hundred years later, was it a couple hundred? 11? No, maybe just 100, 150 something. That's still the definition. So that became the definition, and now it's still the basic definition. And the Yale professor that I talked about basically used it also. That's one of the main reasons why he argued to atheists, you shouldn't call. Bless you.
Thank you.
It was very cute.
Better than sounding like it.
Now, if you sneeze, you have to go. Yeah, it's male, female. Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with that. If you're male and you sneeze, it's okay.
I see what's happening.
Sort of. It's a sensitive issue. So Dennis Turner was his name. By the way, I told you I'd remember it.
Good job.
And it's spelled funny. Dennis.
Sounds like Denny.
It is Dennis, actually, but that's how it's spelled. So he was the one that was here. And his argument was, if you use this definition, it really means the same thing as the atheist that says there is no God, except that you're being dumb when you're an atheist and you say that, because obviously you can't prove that there isn't one. But what you're meaning to say is you can't really say anything about something that's defined this way. Any other characteristics you use seem to be contradictory to it. Because if you say God is all-powerful, you can ask something dumb, like, well, can he create a rock that's too heavy for him to lift? You know, if he's omnibeneficent, all good, why is there such misery and pain and stuff? You know, why do we have 5,000 migrants marching in a column through Mexico? 7,000 now?
Yeah, they're getting
they're getting
people are joining.
It's gonna, you know, all of Mexico is gonna be like, let us in. You know, and all we have to do is put a wall there that has like a revolving door with no exit on the other side. So as they get in, they come out and they're like, hey, how would they know? They know which way is north. You know? I've seen them, and not a single one of them has a GPS, as far as I can tell.
Do they know where the sun sets and rises?
They didn't have schools.
I'm assuming if there's that many of them, at least some of them are going to know where to go.
You know what it is? They're following the road. That's, you know, you can see they're all on the road.
You have to start covering up the road.
Just get some like
The Mexican
smiling
police are
coyotes.
like on both sides of the road, just go that way. El Norte. Norte. You know.
You can get sidetracked and go to marks and take years.
So, Dennis points out to atheists, it's really dumb to claim you're an atheist. Instead, you should say that you're agnostic. You don't know. And then you're in agreement with all of the theologians today, who basically all agree that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, and so therefore we can't really say anything else about him, but we like to try. And one of the examples of someone who decided to try, of course, is Aquinas, who gives us the 5 ways. So these are proofs that God exists. They don't work as well as the ontological argument, which seems to be just a mathematical argument that you can't really dispute unless you just don't like it, basically, right? But what Aquinas does is he's an Aristotelian. So, well, okay, just quick piece here from Augustine, St. Augustine, who was 420 plus AD, right? Was like the father of the church, gave us the first dogma of what became eventually the universal church, the Catholic Church, right? And a lot of people still adhere to basically all of that. Remember, if you go to seminary, you study Augustine's sermons, etc., right? So a lot of the sermons you still get today are basically Augustine regurgitated, because that's basically the way the story works out, right? The trouble is, Augustine was a Platonist, which meant he viewed the scientific explanation for the universe based on Plato's philosophy. But remember, Plato's philosophy was immediately outdone by his student Aristotle, that pointed out all the mistakes that Plato made. And so we end up with an Aristotelian point of view, which is essentially much superior, obviously superior to Plato. Thing is, Aristotle kind of disappeared from view after he died because the Athenians didn't like him, because he was a friend, teacher of Alexander the Great, Macedonian, not a Greek, depending on, they still argue over that, you know. The Macedonians just now reached an agreement with Greece to call themselves North Macedonia so that they can be accepted into the EU. Because for years they've been fighting over being called Macedonians because the Greeks didn't want, well, forget it. You get, it was a weird, but they've solved it, I think, as far as I know. In any case, so Aristotle was out of the picture until after the Crusades. With the Crusades, the Crusaders brought with them monks, like, for example, St. Francis of Assisi. Yes? St. Francis? Pretty darn cool. I mean, he's one of the ones with, you know, the Crusaders, and he actually ends up engaged with Saladin, right? So... What's a good search key?
It is the height of the Crusades. Muslims and Christians have been fighting one another in a war that has raged 120 years. As death and misery mount, St. Francis of Assisi and the Sultan of Egypt, Mohammed al-Kamil, nephew of the famous Salah ad-Din, defy their angry times and human nature itself to cross the bloody battle lines and meet in peace. But will it make a difference? How does anyone stop the violence in a seemingly endless conflict?
We are more than just our daily struggles. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. The Lord has made us for a greater purpose, to be instruments of His peace.
When Al-Kamel comes to the throne, he's in a rather precarious position.
These two were indeed seeking peace in the midst of war, so they were open to being transformed by the person who was allegedly their enemy.
A lot of St. Francis's prayer is actually a result of his learning about the Quran, using some of the Quran as his material. So that's cool. So that's cool. So they bring back wisdom from the Arabs that they had lost. And by the way, that also entails Moses ben Maimon, who was the physician, theologian, who was Jewish, but Saladin's counselor, and he basically has got all of Aristotle's works plus his own commentaries on them, which he gives to the monks. And they take them back to Europe. And I like to think of this as kind of like the movie Independence Day, where that was the only time I ever saw an Apple computer successfully upload something to another computer system. And of course, it actually destroyed the mothership of the aliens, right? So that goes to show, don't connect Apple machines to other systems. They will destroy that, right? It's a joke. If Apple wants to convince me not to, they can send me money. That would be okay. Or free systems, that would work. Maybe. Okay, so Aristotle has come back to Europe over the space of roughly, look at the time gap there, you're looking at least 150, 200 years. That's going to end up transforming all the monks that read the stuff because they realize, oh, this is much superior to Plato, and the trouble is, all of church dogma is based on Plato. What do? Well, you become a heretic, or do you somehow transform the dogma? And Aquinas is the one that the Pope asks, okay, fix it, right? And so he does. He basically incorporates Aristotle's work into the dogma. And hence we get the Summae, right, which are the answers to all of this. And if you look at any of the examples, so let's pick one. Okay, so this is the beginning, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. It is a science, etc. Scientia means knowledge, so it is a science, etc. Is it a science, for example? Every single one of these examples is set up the same way. You end up with objections and on the contrary. The reason you have two of those is because you have the dogma on the one hand, which is Platonist, and then you have Aristotle on the other. And by the way, Aristotle is always referred to as the philosopher. They don't name him as Aristotle, they just call him the philosopher, as if there aren't any others out there. Notice Augustine, of course it depends on which way you go, right? Whether the objections are from the one side or the other, depending, right? In this case, Augustine is on the contrary but obviously Augustine would be. The old dogma, right? To this science alone belongs that whereby saving faith is begotten, etc. But it seems that sacred doctrine is not a science, for every science proceeds from self-evident principles, which is an Aristotelian point of view. But sacred doctrine proceeds from articles of faith, which are not self-evident, since their truth is not admitted by all. For all men have not faith. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not a science. Further, no science deals with individual facts, but this sacred science treats of individual facts, such as the deeds of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc. Usually science concerns universals, definitions, right? All men are mortal, that kind of thing. But he always then gives you an I answer that. And this is the way that you put both into context. So in every case, he explains there are actually two contexts of talking about this. The one which is the old dogma, and the new one which is the Aristotelian point of view. And they're both okay. So you get it? You know, there's two ways of interpreting the word, usually, right? So I answer that sacred doctrine is a science. We must bear in mind that there are two kinds of sciences. There are some which proceed from a principle known by the natural light of intelligence, such as arithmetic and geometry and the like. There are some which proceed from principles known by the light of a higher science. Thus, the science of perspective proceeds from principles established by geometry, and music from principles established by arithmetic, etc. Are you familiar with the trivium and the quadrivium? You ever heard those? Okay, so there, through the Middle Ages, there were different courses that you could take. Probably will give me both, right? Okay, so you have the four subjects of arts taught after the teaching of the trivium. Let me do the trivium first. So the trivium includes all the language ones. So you start off with grammar. You can't learn stuff unless you understand the grammar of your language. Next, you have to study logic, because you have to be able to understand arguments, right? So you see you're moving up, right? And then rhetoric, which is speechifying or giving great big speeches, right? So you go logic, you get individual logic for arguments, and you combine it into larger things, and you get rhetoric. So those are the first three subjects you study. And then you get to the quadrivium, which gives us, hey, where did they go? Where are they? Ah, okay, here they are. Arithmetic, next one up. Geometry, which is, if you think about it, arithmetic is 1 + 1 = 2, right? Geometry is when you're talking about the arithmetic of spaces, right? So it's built entirely on arithmetic, plus you're talking about lines and shapes and things, right? And then you've got music, and you might wonder, well, what the hell is music? Music is mathematical. And strictly speaking, what we're doing here is going up. And where do you see music? You don't. It's invisible. It's only auditory, right? So as far as they were concerned, music is up there, right? Right? And by the way, it's also like the music of the spheres, because they thought the stars, planets, all moving were actually choruses, because there's angels pushing them. That's what an angel is, a messenger who pushes the planets, right? And the chorus of angels are, because you've got multiple, yes, right? You get it? So and you could even, so seraphim, shoot, I don't remember all of them. You remember? There's lots of different choruses of angels, etc. And what are they? They're various levels, etc. So the belief was, if I shoot an arrow in the air, you hear it. And the planets are moving, so they must be making a noise. And of course, it's way up there where everything is perfect, so it must be perfect harmony. So that's the music of the spheres, choir of heavenly angels, however you want to think of it. And then look at the one that's next, astronomy. So that's the quadrivium and the trivium, right? Which just means the 4 subjects and the 3 subjects, right? Quad, right, etc. So that's fun. So they are science. So theology is a science, and that's how you learn sacred doctrine. So the principles of any science are either in themselves self-evident or reducible to the conclusions of a higher science, etc. Individual facts, etc. Okay. Is it one science, etc.? So you can see he's got answers to all of those questions for you. What? Okay. So let's take a look at the existence of God. Is the proposition God exists self-evident? Go away. So it seems that the existence of God is self-evident. This is objection 1. Right? Self-evident to people like Anselm, for example. Right? Now those things are said to be self-evident to us, the knowledge of which is naturally implanted in us, as we can see in regard to first principles. But as Jamison says, the knowledge, so you can see that's the orthodox faith, right? The fide is faith, and then an abbreviation for orthodox. The knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all. Therefore, the existence of God is self-evident. Further, those things are said to be self-evident which are known as soon as the terms are known, which the philosopher, which is Aristotle, says is true, the first principles of demonstration. Thus, when the nature of the whole and of a part is known, it is at once recognized that every whole is greater than its part, etc. Right? Third, the existence of truth is self-evident, for whoever denies the existence of truth grants that truth does not exist. And if truth does not exist, then the proposition truth does not exist is true. Whoa. And if there is anything true, there must be truth. But God is truth itself. I am the way, the truth, and the life, from John. Right? Therefore, God exists is self-evident. But on the contrary, no one can mentally admit the opposite of what is self-evident, as the philosopher states in his book Metaphysics, right? Concerning the first principles demonstration. But the opposite of the proposition God is can't be mentally admitted. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. Therefore, that God exists is not self-evident. I answer that. I love this. This is absolutely fantastic. Because he's basically explaining there are foolish people out there who don't get it. Right? So, how's it work? A thing can be self-evident in either of 2 ways. On the one hand, self-evident in itself, though not to us. On the other, self-evident in itself and to us. You get it? A proposition is self-evident because the predicate is included in the essence of the subject, as man is an animal, for animal is contained in the essence of man. If therefore the essence of the predicate and the subject be known to all, the proposition will be self-evident to all, as is clear with regard to the first principles of demonstration, the terms of which are common things, etc., etc., etc. Therefore, it happens, as Boethius says, that there are some mental concepts self-evident only to the learned, as that incorporeal substances are not in space. Therefore, I say that this proposition, God exists, of itself is self-evident, for the predicate is the same as the subject, because God is his own existence, as will be hereafter shown. Now, because we do not know the essence of God, the proposition is not self-evident to us, but needs to be demonstrated by things that are more known to us, though less known in their nature, namely by effects. So the reply is, to know that God exists is a general and confused way, is implanted in us by nature, etc. Objection Objection 2, perhaps not everyone who hears this word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be taught. See, most folks don't know that until they study Anselm, right? It's a philosophy class. So most folks that don't have philosophy classes and don't have Anselm, they're not talking with theologians, right? Because they're not aware of the definition of God. You guys have no excuse, though, because you've got it, right? You're all set. So this word God is signified something than which nothing greater can be thought. Nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. We can conceive of the concept, right? Nor can it be argued that it actually exists unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. And this precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist, etc. But we can do this in other ways. So we can demonstrate that God exists in 5 ways. And one is through the cause. Okay, so it's 5 ways, but you break them down into 5. The 5. 4 of those are based on cause. The 5th one is based on telos, or purpose, or design, the so-called design argument, right? So the first 4 are referred to as the cosmological arguments. Remember, we had the ontological argument. That's ontos, the definition, right? But cosmological are the arguments based on the cosmos. So I look at stuff, right? The cosmos, and see how things work, right? And so you get these 5 ways. And they're basically all the same, and they come from Aristotle, who basically argues, okay, so stuff is moving, but in order for something to move, something has to move it, and before that is moved, it has to be moved by something else, and something else, and something else, and something else. So everything that's moving has been moved originally by a first mover, a prime mover, which hasn't been moved by anything else. And that has to be God. That's Aristotle, actually, the prime mover argument. But now, of course, that becomes Aquinas applying it to theology. By the way, his solution, the idea that everything has to be understood in multiple contexts, right? That includes an overall perspective of the science. So, for example, if you think about Plato, I'd like to just think of 2 circles. One of these circles is matter for Plato, and the other one is the ideas. Right? Ideas are non-material, they're abstract concepts that don't take up physical space, but the universe as a cosmos spatial, right? So for Plato, you've got these 2 things. Matter, we can recognize matter because the ideas enable us to understand that this is a chair, etc. Right? The reason I know that is because I have ideas. So it's kind of a merging of the 2, right? That might seem pretty dumb. Aristotle comes along and says, we actually only have the universe that includes matter. Everything has to have substance. And then you have the ideas, which are also the forms, right? Those are the shapes of things. And then we have the efficient cause. You remember this? So this is the tools, the work that's done that transforms things. And then this is the purpose. So these are the 4 causes according to Aristotle, right? And so this is gone. And remember, for Augustine and Christianity in general, from Augustine on, this is also heaven. where heaven is. The idea is it's the invisible. This is the visible. And if you look at the creed, if you remember, God created the visible and the invisible. So God created this too, right? In that case, though, if this is all gone, there is no heaven. Rats. You know, that's where you were hoping to go, right? And your soul, by the way, which is like the idea is, whoa, that has to be transformed. Remember, Aristotle argues that your soul is the activity of the body. But that also suggests that once the body's gone, where's your soul? No more activity. Not good, right? Aquinas out-Plato's Plato and out-Aristotle's Aristotle by saying both of these philosophers are correct. Okay, how does that work? It sounds like they're in conflict. Aquinas says, no, you're misunderstanding. This is existence. And this is essence. So everything has essence. And if it exists, so I end up with a chair that's made of matter, has a form, was made in the factory, probably in China, and has a purpose, which it doesn't fit very well because it's too tall for somebody short like me, little short stuff. But I mean, I can get up here, and it makes me feel like a little kid. That's the truth. Makes me like this. Which is also why I don't go to bars. Because they make those round stools and I have to try to one cheek it, because otherwise you don't look very masculine. So Aquinas says both of these are right. It's a matter of vocabulary, and we all talk that way. We all think, yes, this has, you know, all these physical characteristics, it's a real one, but why do I know that it's a chair? Because it fits the essence of what chairness is, which is Plato. So if you think about it, thanks to Aquinas, all Europeans think in terms of both Platonism and Aristotelianism, which enables us to have a double ontology. In other words, instead of just the Platonic ontology, the definition of things, or the Aristotelian ontology definition of things, we have a double ontology as we put the two of them together, which is much more complex and has caused much more arguments, as you can imagine, because people are still going to argue over whether universals exist. Do ideas actually have physical being or not? They're just not getting their history right. Okay. So when we look at the cosmological argument, it's broken down into four, like some necessity and so on. But basically they're all the same, that says, well, here's now, and now came from before now, and before now came from before that, etc. But you can't go on ad infinitum. We use n for infinite, or I could just use this. This is Mobius strip, right? That gives us the infinite, right? You can't just do this, because if the past were infinite, we would actually still be moving into the past instead of into the future. See how that works? If you haven't thought of it, you should spend at least a night. Alcohol is not involved. You know, just spend a night. Oh. Orange juice, it works just as well. In any case, so yeah, if the past is infinite, time can't be moving forward. it still would be going that way to get to the beginning. Hasn't begun yet. A little bit easier to conceive of it going this way. So we've got the infinite this way, right? And so therefore there must have been a prime mover, a first mover. Okay, so that's the first set, the 4 reasons, right? And then you've got the teleological argument, right? Which is also referred to as the design. So that's pretty easy. I think everyone's familiar with the design argument. The idea that it's so perfect that it couldn't have just happened by accident. That seems to be Darwin's most dangerous idea, by the way, which is the title. Darwin's dangerous idea, right? And that is that, yes, evolution as a theory does not require a designer. It could happen by accident. This is actually quite puzzling. Stuart Kaufman, in talking about evolution, points out that there's no way, Jose, that you could actually have life as it is in the amount of time the universe has existed, because there's so many different options at each possible level that all of them could not have been tried out and the successful ones weeded out. There has to have been something that designed the direction evolution has taken in order for things to have worked out the way they have. So that's a physics argument, by the way. So physicists are involved in this. Kaufman is a biologist and a philosopher, right? I think I've mentioned him before, Stuart Kaufman. Yes. So that's really where science is actually fighting over that. What's the trick? How did the universe somehow design things so that it would work out? So finches, or well, whatever birds they were, right? You know, they're in an environment. The environment has certain food. The weather changes and the trees change. Which ones have the fruit? Somehow, mysteriously, by the next season, the birds that are flourishing are the birds that are able to eat that fruit, which means they have different bills and stuff, right? Well, how did they know ahead of time so that the right birds arrived in time in order to eat the right fruit, right? And it's not like you've got a whole bunch of dead birds that were, they didn't work this year. No, it's the birds that can live in that environment that did show up. So that seems like there's some kind of order in the universe. Which I can ask, that would be a good quiz question. Somehow we get order for free. So I guess, how about this as a quiz question? Is this doable? This is like a monstrous question, but how does evolution get its design? How does it get its design? How does it make us? If you think about it, we seem perfectly adapted to our environment. Strictly speaking, following Darwin, it would have been explained by chance. All kinds of life forms would be tried. But guess what? It seems like there's just a very limited set that continue on. They're designed specifically for the environment. By the way, your children can be designed for the environment. We now know that it's not just our genetics, but it's also our epigenetics, right? You heard that? Epigenetics. That might even be your answer, right? So your parents experience stuff, and then they have about 2 minutes of fun, and it's kind of cool. I can actually see pictures that my parents took of the place where I was conceived. That's pretty neat. Well, I was the hotel, and my dad wrote on the postcard, "We are here." He drew an arrow to the window, and I figured, well, between the hours of 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock, I became a blastocyst or something of that, whatever it is, the one that's rolling down. You know that? And then by the next day, when they bought a camera and my mom was sitting there posing, I was there. Pretty little, but nonetheless, I was there. And 8.5 months later, voila, I arrived. So that's pretty cool. I've got all that. But even while you're in the womb, it is a womb with a view. It's a womb with a view. Room with a view. It's a womb of one's own. Nobody gets it. Room of one's own?
What if you're a twin?
A Schwellingspaar. German for twin. Schwellingspaar. Isn't that a neat concept? Because it's a swelling pair. Germans come up with some pretty cool stuff. Like Volkswagen. Yeah, so, well, I've got a quiz though. So I gave you a quiz question. Yeah, the epigenetics is what's going on while you're developing. And guess what? Your genes are actually a whole set of switches. And so even though you've got your set, mom is switching the switches the whole time you're growing. So as she's experiencing things, that experience is passed on to you by the way the switches are set. So that kind of throws out the whole possibility of test tube babies, because you need mom. Mom is switching switches the whole time.
Or you could find a really complex way to switch the switches in the right way.
That could be. That's scary. Yeah. Plus, the biologist that would be switching the switches would be dressed like Beaker. Remember Beaker?
He's like the mouth. It's like.
He's the one that, right?
Peter, I told you never to talk to me like that. Because I can't understand it.
Is this an unusual class? I tried to be.
Und hoffe, du nimmst es an, hier ist mein Herz, ich möchte es dir geben, wenn du es noch willst, werde ich's in deine Hände legen. Und es tut mir so leid, dass damals habe ich gedacht, es wäre aus und vorbei mit uns. vergiss es nicht, denn ich will dich so sehr.
It's too loud.
Häuser gezogen, es stimmt, ich hab für meine Erinnerung, ja Kind, hab ich keinen Reiz ausgelassen. Ich dachte, ich will was verpassen, ich bin wieder da, denn ich will dich so sehr.
Yeah, what I should, thanks. Can you remind me next class to break anyone who wants to into a group to talk about that? That's what I should have done, but you know, not very many folks are that worried about it, actually. So, but it is a good idea.
Yeah, I thought about saying something, but you were kind of
That was
rolling.
fun. That was fun. It's a really cool topic. I like it.
Yeah. Do you have the link to that page you were reading about? The 5 groups and stuff?
Yes. You could find it by just going Aquinas, Thomas. Thank you, and it's Summa Theologica. But the one I went to, there's multiple copies of it, of course. So I don't. You could play with it, I guess. I guess it works the same way. But I went to the one on New Advent.
Okay.
And notice that, yeah, you could go to the second part, first part, the second part, man's last end, etc. You know, we get in it. You know, what's the point? And in the last day, what's the goal of being a man? That's a lifetime's commitment to study all of that, of course. But, you know, you never talked about Miracles either. Which is flourishing is a good life.
One last thing, looking at philosophers again. Oh yeah, who was the philosopher that we discussed who went to college and wanted to learn all about the meaning of life and stuff, but then found out they were all doing metaphysics?
That was McGee, Brian, R-Y-A-N, McGee.
And then he came to America and was like,
At Yale. And Yale actually. So Brian McGee,
awesome.
he's still alive as far as I know.
Yeah, that's kind of
He's kind of in a retirement home. Can't walk anymore. Well, 89.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a friend who's going to be 95 in December, and he still walks, talks, remembers stuff.
Remember stuff?
Yeah. I think of him as my psychiatrist. He is a retired psychiatrist.
How to keep a cool head all those years up and a long time.
He actually joined the army the day after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. He was a student at ASU, and once the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, he had that impulse to do something just like this. So a lot of people all lined up, recruiters, and he joined them. That's awesome. So he was a veteran of World War II. I am too, which is odd. But the reason, I wasn't born until 1951. But my first duty station was in Field Station, Berlin. And Berlin never signed a surrender. So strictly speaking, Berlin, and the reason we could occupy it the way we did, all the powers occupied it. So Russia had East Berlin, the U.S. had southern Berlin, the the middle section on that west side, and the French had the north section. So we all occupied it. And so when you were stationed there for the first 3 months, you earned the Army of Occupation Medal, which is a World War II medal. So I'm officially a veteran of World War II, even though I was there from 80 to 81. And by the way, the other site, a place where you could be stationed that you would earn the same medal, is Okinawa.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, I mean, I never you know, when they say, all the veterans of World War II, you know, you see these. It's just, no, I would have to explain that, and that would be dumb.
Yeah.
Not going to do it.
Not going to work. They say, how were you in banks? Well, technically.
Exactly.
Let me break out all the politics. But
yeah,
really,
it's
because the
now.
war was
I
over.
don't think that's the. Of course, Berlin has been. We've left there entirely because the wall came in. There's no excuse. It's all one Germany now.
Still in Okinawa, though.
I imagine so. I imagine so.
Yeah, I have a friend who, I know, who was stationed there less than 10 years ago.
And they have their army about it. I guess it's red, Schwarz, Weiß, Rot, red, white, black. The same. Sure, it's the same level.
Well, that would be true. I'll ask him. What's the name of it again? The
Army of Occupation. I could have showed it to you. They're all available. You could all pull them all up. Life. It's amazing. Theology is absolutely fascinating. Dennis Turner is not a priest, but he's a theology professor. Go figure. You know, so I don't think he has any church affiliation. Miroslav, who I put on the video, is absolutely fascinating. Oh, it's still on. Stop. It takes so long to stop. He was Orthodox. He was from Croatia. But I mean, he's obviously been teaching in the U.S. for a long time.